Hello there. During a career of nearly 60 years, Richard Avedon managed to blur the lines between different genres of photography as he delved into fashion and reportage and portraiture. He covered an enormous breadth of subject matter. He broke the stiff, formal mode of fashion photography and created images that were alive and reflected the mood of the times. He also helped to cement photography's status as a legitimate contemporary art form. You can always recognize an Avedon photograph when you see it. In his portraiture, he managed to produce a very stripped-down aesthetic that draws the viewer's attention towards the subject's expression. But instead of them being lifeless and sterile, he manages to reveal concealed layers to their personalities. He photographed icons such as Martin Luther King, Marilyn Monroe, and the Beatles. And the New York Times claimed that his photographs helped to define America's image of style, beauty, and culture. Richard Avedon was born in 1923 in New York City to a Russian Jewish family and went to school in the Bronx. He was interested in photography from an early age, and he joined the Young Men's Hebrew Association Camera Club when he was just 12 years old. With his Kodak Brownie camera, he began taking pictures of his younger sister Louise, his first model. Following high school, Avedon went to Columbia University, but he dropped out and a year later joined the US Merchant Marines. He served as a photographer, and his job was to take identity photographs. Soon after leaving, he started working professionally, making images for Harper's Bazaar, and he studied under the magazine's art director, Alexei Brodovich. There were a lot of external factors that coincided with the start of Avedon's career. There was great enthusiasm for innovation after the war, and photography was on the rise, and there was interest in the new frontiers that were being explored through the medium. The 35mm camera was invented, and then street photography became a possibility. Avedon was aware of these developments, but he believed that the decisive moment belonged to the journalistic photographers and the street photographers, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Lisette Model, and others. But he borrowed from the street photography aesthetic for his fashion work. He included elements of spontaneity and the idea of the candid shot. Instead of posing his models like shop window dummies, Avedon staged scenes in which women were laughing, drinking wine, and he often added a good-looking guy as a prop. In this way, he revolutionized the vocabulary of fashion photography. He was also the first major photographer to use models of color. He managed to create an ideal for American women to aspire to. On a deeper level, he illustrated how changing women's fashions signaled changes in their relationships with men and their sexuality, their position in society, and their economic status. Avedon's big break or move came in 1947 when Christian Dior was revolutionizing ladies' fashions. The French designer was presenting a collection that marked a new age of fashion after the austerity war years. Avedon was sent to Paris by Harper's to photograph this groundbreaking show. But while he was there, they asked him to photograph the collection. He was a newcomer on the scene, and he could have easily tried to copy the conventional style of fashion photography that was established by Cecil Beaton or Horst. But he grabbed onto this opportunity to make his mark. He took the models and the clothes onto the streets and into the bars of Paris. So instead of statue-like frozen in time models of the conventional fashion photography, he gave his subjects personality and even flaws. He realized that fashion photography wasn't simply about selling a product, but rather it was about the overall mood and the story that the image told. He developed a unique black and white style in which he captured raw, intimate emotion while still maintaining a sense of formality. He understood that photography had a unique power to suggest a subject's personality. His approach was very appealing to the publishing world because he was able to maintain a sense of elegance while including a feeling of playful reality. Avedon was not only a good photographer, but he was also good at managing his career. After 20 years at Harper's Bazaar, Avedon left the magazine and then joined Vogue, where he worked for another 20 years. After that, he became the first staff photographer at the New Yorker, and his portraiture helped redefine the magazine's aesthetic. He also ran a very successful commercial studio throughout this time, working for clients like Calvin Klein, Revlon, Versace, and other companies. This income from these lucrative contracts gave him the freedom to pursue his own ambitious personal projects. He once traveled to Vietnam as a US war correspondent to produce a series in protest against the war. His personal work often overlapped with his paid work. When he wasn't photographing fashion, essentially he was a portrait photographer. Avedon's primary skill in portraiture was his ability to develop a rapport with his subjects. He also happened to be technically highly proficient, and he had a heightened sense of aesthetics. His portraits are often unsettling and in many cases disturbing. His subjects take up much of the composition, sometimes even being cropped off by the frame. The effect of this close-up technique is not only to provide detail, including physical imperfections, but it's also to make the viewer feel as if they've intruded into the sitter's personal, private space. Additionally, Avedon's signature white backdrop offers no context, so there's no story for you to grab onto. So the viewer is restricted to the face and the body of the subject. Usually the portraits are black and white, which also makes them more unforgiving. In 1969, Avedon was at a crossroads. He traded his handheld Rolleiflex for a larger 8x10 camera. He also reinvented his studio dynamic. So instead of dancing around his subjects from behind a viewfinder as he had in his fashion pictures, he would now stand beside a stationary camera and meet his subjects head-on. He made huge portraits which he referred to as photomurals. His subjects were the giants of the 20th century, artists, activists, politicians, and the size of the prints reflected their vast cultural influence. They were meant to be seen as monumental, some as wide as 35 feet, and they challenged viewers to observe these larger-than-life subjects in a humble manner. This portrait shows the anti-war activist group called the Chicago Seven, who had been charged by the federal government with conspiracy and other crimes related to the anti-war protests. Avedon's first book, called Observations, was published in 1959 and the writer Truman Capote wrote the essay. Many famous and important people were featured, and Diane Arbus remarked about Avedon, saying anyone who entered Avedon's studio was some kind of star. Basically what she was saying is that even if the sitter wasn't famous going into Avedon's studio, they would be famous when they came out. In terms of his portraiture aesthetic, his approach was closer to Warhol than it was to his friend Arbus. Arbus's images were startling because of their shocking content, whereas Avedon just shows us something that we are familiar with, and then we are shocked by the revealed layers that we find beneath. August Sander was probably the master of this deadpan documentary photography approach. After taking tens of thousands of pictures during the war, Avedon seemed to have this aesthetic in his head, and he returned to it later in life. He was also intensely competitive and was insecure about what people thought about his work. He was driven to become well regarded for his studio photographs in the same way that Robert Frank was gaining a reputation for his street work. Frank was embraced by the art world, and he was considered to be a photographer's photographer. The art world, however, kept Avedon at bay for most of his life. There was a sense that anyone who was so commercially successful, especially in the sphere of fashion, could not possibly be seen as a serious photographer. Diane Arbus and Avedon were friends, but she was seen as the artist, and this added to his insecurities. I think his portrait series called In the American West shifted people's perception about Avedon away from the idea that he was solely a fashion photographer. Even though the work wasn't initially highly rated, the photographs are raw and powerful and honest, and it was difficult for critics not to sit up and engage with this work. His photographs were eventually shown in major exhibitions at MoMA and the Met and at the Whitney. In his lifetime, he changed the way that we look and respond to fashion. He developed an almost ruthless approach to portraiture, which opened the door for future generations to explore the expansion of what we can call documentary portraiture. One can probably trace Diane Arbus's Misfits and Nan Goldin's Outsiders to his influence. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.